Hi, and welcome to That's Ready Mysterious. Join me for an intriguing look into real-life mysteries. Who was the mad gasser of Mattoon? What was whaling at the Wilga waterhole? I'm not going to solve those mysteries, but they'll be interesting to learn about. I'm your host, Kelly with an I. Transcripts and references for all episodes can be found at that'sreadymysterious.wordpress.com. No apostrophe and no exclamation point. Today's tale is about Janet Parker. On Wednesday, August 16th, 1978, Glenda Miller called Janet to check in with her. Glenda said, "Janet sounded tired. Then she said, 'I've never felt so ill in my life, and that was it. I never heard any more.' Smallpox was an illness caused by the variola virus. It was extremely contagious. Variola major killed approximately 30% of all people who contracted it. Variola minor killed about 1%. No one knows when it first began, but the finding of smallpox-like rashes on Egyptian mummies suggests the virus had been around for at least 3,000 years. The earliest written description of smallpox came from the 4th century in China. The incubation period for smallpox was 12 days. This means that 12 days after contracting the variola virus, a person would begin to feel symptoms. The first symptoms were fever, headache, and fatigue. A few days later, a person would experience flu-like symptoms and a rash. Eventually, the rash spread across the skin and into the throat and mouth. The first steps toward a smallpox vaccine came in 1796 when Edward Jenner, an English doctor, noticed that milkmaids who had contracted cowpox were protected against smallpox. In 1959, the World Health Organization, or WHO, began a plan to eradicate smallpox from the world. In 1967, the efforts grew stronger with the intensified eradication program. In 1978, the WHO was just about to declare smallpox had been eradicated when Janet Parker contracted it. Janet Whitcomb Parker was born in March of 1938. She died on September 11, 1978, at the age of 40. She was the world's last smallpox victim. Janet was a medical photographer in the anatomy department of Birmingham Medical School in the UK. Janet had been assigned to a darkroom that sat directly above the lab working with smallpox. The lab, run by Henry Bedson, was to be shut down at the end of 1978. Smallpox had been all but eradicated, and the work into the disease was no longer considered important. Bedson rushed ahead with his experiments, despite the fact that a WHO inspection team had declared the lab outdated and potentially unsafe. Parker was supposedly exposed to smallpox on July 25th while ordering supplies in an office next door to her darkroom. The office shared a duct with the lab. On August 11th, she began feeling ill. Her doctor made a house call and initially determined that she was suffering from chickenpox. Parker had had chickenpox as a child, and her mother, who nursed her through that illness, said this was nothing like it. Parker was admitted to Catherine de Barnes Isolation Hospital on August 20th. The people closest to Parker were immediately quarantined and vaccinated. Everyone who came into contact with Parker was questioned about their movements. By August 28th, more than 500 people had been vaccinated. On September 5th, Parker's 77-year-old father died in quarantine of an apparent heart attack. No autopsy was performed due to the fears of smallpox exposure. On September 6th, Professor Bedson killed himself, leaving behind a note which read in part, "I am sorry to have misplaced the trust which so many of my friends and colleagues have placed in me and my work." On September 11th, 1978, Janet Parker succumbed to smallpox. An undertaker was sent and found her body packed in sawdust, soaked in disinfectant, and wrapped in a transparent body bag. On the day of Janet Parker's funeral, all the other ceremonies at the cemetery were canceled. Immediately following the ceremony, the cemetery was fumigated. Parker's mother got a very mild case of smallpox. She was vaccinated on August 24th and developed symptoms on September 7th. She was quarantined in the hospital and discharged on September 22nd. She missed the funerals of both her husband and daughter. On October 16th, Birmingham was declared free of the disease. How was Janet Parker infected with smallpox? Professor Henry Bedson helped Professor Geddes diagnose Parker. Professor Geddes said, "I said, 'Can you see anything, Henry?' And he never answered, so I gently moved his head aside so I could look down the microscope, and there were brick-shaped particles that are characteristic of the smallpox virus. He was horrified because there was little doubt that in some way the smallpox virus had escaped from his laboratory and had infected Mrs. Parker. It made little sense that Parker would have contracted the illness elsewhere, but how did she get infected at the medical school? Was it transmitted through the vents? If so, why had no one else contracted the illness? In October of 1979, 3 judges at Birmingham's Magistrates Court determined that the University of Birmingham was not responsible for getting Janet Parker ill. Henry Benson had been exonerated. In 1980, the government commissioned a report called the Shooter Report. The report said that there was no doubt that Mrs. Parker was infected at the laboratory. It said the transfer of the virus would have happened in one of 3 ways. The first is that the virus was carried on an air current. Tests of the cabinet that held the smallpox samples showed no escape of tracers. Tests done when the door to the animal room was left open showed it was possible for some tracers to get into the animal room from the cabinet. The second possibility was through personal contact. Through interviews, the authors of the report were able to determine that the people who worked in the lab that Janet Parker came into contact with didn't enter the smallpox room. The third possible cause of exposure was contact with contaminated equipment or apparatus leaving the laboratory. It was determined that Parker may have had contact with contaminated equipment, but so did a PhD student in the anatomy department who did not fall ill. There was no indication that Parker actually came into contact with the equipment. Smallpox could have accidentally been removed from the lab, but there was no evidence of that happening. The theory that the virus was in the air ducts wasn't really believed by the people who would know. Parker's movements showed that she didn't enter the smallpox lab, but did enter the darkroom with an entrance about 15 feet from the lab, as well as the telephone room, which was right above the animal lab. Professor Deborah Simmons was the first to see Parker after she was admitted to the hospital. Simmons reflected on the incident. Why did she die? Why did she get it so badly? If we couldn't find out what happened 40 years ago, it won't suddenly become clear now. In 1980, the WHO declared smallpox eradicated. We no longer vaccinate against it because it is no longer out in the wild. As good as this is, it does mean that smallpox would be a great option for bioterrorism. How did Janet Parker contract smallpox? Did it get into the air supply? Why was she the only person to contract the disease? What do you think? Leave a comment and let me know what you think. Thanks for listening to today's episode of That's Ready Mysterious. Join me next week for another captivating mystery.